Welcome to my presentation, and thank you so much for being here today. I want to start us off with taking a moment to think about a time in your life where maybe you got sick and someone else in your life did not, or you ended up staying healthy, although a bunch of people around you fell ill. So this is a problem that many people have been perplexed by for many generations and has been studied from all different fields. The biological field has looked at it from hygiene, genetic predisposition, and natural immunity, whereas a religious standpoint comes from God's will as well as your faith in the God you choose to worship. And the psychological standpoint comes from the idea that we are predisposed to an illness depending on if we are physically or mentally healthy. The most well-known people for the topic of research in terms of psychological health and mental well-being are Sheldon Cohen, David Tyrrell, and Andrew Smith. In 1991 and in 1993, they provided conclusive evidence that stress leads to an increase in likelihood of catching an illness. In the closing discussion of their article, they used the quote, "We hope that the future research will identify components of psychological stress that are responsible for different effects on pathology." Again, in 1998, just 5 years later, Cohen built a new team of people consisting of Frank, Doyle, Schoner, Gwaltney, and Rabin to carry out said future research. The study they performed followed a very similar schedule where they made sure the people were physically healthy and exposed them to a virus after measuring their stress levels. Now, let's take a moment to pause again and reflect on what stress is to each of us. Now, this is a very subjective term where the dictionary definition will not mean very much to any of us. However, it is a part of all of our lives that we have experienced to some extent or another. Now, for each person, stress looks different. Some, it might come in the form of acute stress, such as presenting in front of a large crowd, failing a test, or long-term stress, such as family conflicts. For the sake of their study, in order to gather quantitative results, Cohen and his team categorized stress into acute stress, meaning less than a month, and chronic stress, meaning more than a month. So this study I have referenced multiple times, and they operated under the goal of trying to find out what types of stressors increase susceptibility to the common cold in healthy adults. As I already mentioned briefly, they took into account all types of stress that could include, but are not limited to, losing a job, divorce, moving, death of a loved one, bad grades, poor job performance, or financial troubles. Quickly, before we dive into the depths of this study, I want to take a quick overview so you can follow what is happening. So Cohen and his team looked at healthy adults of all age ranges, as well as ethnicities and education levels. These participants filled out a survey which enabled the researchers to determine the level of stress that these people were experiencing in their lives, as well as if it was acute or chronic. After undergoing rigorous physical screening, they were exposed to the common cold and then isolated, where their symptoms were monitored daily. After they were done the study, the researchers did a statistical analysis of the data in order to make conclusions that were able to be recognized in the scientific field. The dependent and independent variables they used were independent, including the level of acute and chronic stress in an individual's life, how long the person had been exposed to the chronic illness, what season they were exposed, and what virus they were exposed to, since there was two. The dependent variable was if the individual would contract the upper respiratory illness. The rest of the study was operated on controlled variables. These included the time a person was in isolation, the amount of the virus they were exposed to, as well as the techniques the researchers used to evaluate if they had developed an illness. In this study, there was 276 people who responded to a newspaper article to allow for random sampling. These people were in different life stages, different backgrounds, and different educations. The majority of them had completed high school, but nothing more, with some ranging between 1 and 4 years of university, and the smallest population had completed more than 4 years of university. All the participants had to be healthy, which by Cohen and his team's definition involved not having any medical diagnoses, not being on any medications, you cannot be pregnant or lactating. In order to measure a person's psychological stress, each participant was asked to fill out the LEDS test 2 times, both 2 weeks prior to the study and at the time they were exposed to the virus and isolated. This test was developed to quantitatively analyze a person's level of stress based on the event that caused or did not cause a stressful event. This allows the participants' test to generate a score that reflects how much stress they are truly experiencing rather than the amount of stress that was perceived by a researcher when they developed the test. Now, there was a number of techniques that the researchers used to develop if a person had a cold or not. In order to be truly counted as infected, a person had to self-report their symptoms and experience at least one of the physical symptoms that were met, or physical symptoms that were measured. The first one they used was the weight of music produced. This one, although a little bit gross, was functional in measuring. Before they went into isolation, they asked the participants to blow into a Kleenex and they would measure the weight of how many Kleenexes the participant used in a day minus the amount of the Kleenex's weight. And then they did this every day in isolation to see if the amount of snot the person was producing increased throughout the week. The second one they used was the mucociliary clearance function. This one, they would put a dark dye in the person's nose and wait for them to see how long it would take the ciliary in the nose to clear all of the mucus from out of it, meaning there was no more stain left. They again measured this one on the first day, as well as each day after the person was exposed to the virus. Cytotoxicity and white blood cells were both measured through a blood test, in which if they saw an increase in white blood cells or a decrease in ATP, they could conclude that a person had experienced the illness and was fighting it off in their body. They also looked at an increase in antibodies to see if a person had contracted the illness. After they collected their results, they employed a variety of statistical methods to analyze their data, all of which were performed at a 95 level of confidence, meaning that 95% or 19 out of 20 times, the people would fall within the confidence interval that they had established. They used linear regressions to compare the 2 variables and confidence intervals to make statements about their broader population from the sample study, and to measure the abnormality of the sample compared to the predicted population. Odds ratio was used to quantify the strength of the association between 2 variables. This is the first chart that they published in their journal. It relates the different lengths of life stressors to the amount of people who developed chronic stress, especially those who had chronic stress lasting 3 months or longer. The RSV-39 and Hanks are the 2 different viruses that people could have been exposed to. The first graph, presented on the left, is a simple representation of how stress over time increases a person's susceptibility to illness, whereas the second bar graph shows how common stressors such as interpersonal and work stress impact a person's susceptibility to getting a cold more than any other stressor does. This final table shows the relationship between unhealthy life practices and the likelihood of contracting a cold. With exception to drinking less than 1 glass of wine a day and low levels of epinephrine, it was concluded that all other unhealthy life practices were statistically important enough to increase a person's susceptibility to a cold. Some other findings that they did not present in charts and graphs included that 84% of people were infected with the virus, whereas only 40% of people developed a cold. This comes back to what I was talking about earlier, when they determined a cold by a person having to self-report symptoms, as well as have a physical sign within the test they performed. 44% of these people would have only had one or the two, therefore could not be concluded that they actually developed a cold. The major conclusions of Cohen's study. Cut that out. Most people weirdly awkward thoughts. Now that we have covered looking at Cohen and his coworkers' studies, looking at what types of stressors increase a person's susceptibility to the common cold, I want you to think back to the very first question I asked you in this study. Have you ever wondered why some people get sick and others do not? In their research, Cohen and his coworkers aimed to answer this question and did so in 5 ways. They stated that those who experience chronic stress get sick more often. Those who have unhealthy behavior patterns get sick more often. Those who have different education levels get sick more often. Some people have natural immunity to some illnesses, and that some people get infected but remain asymptomatic, so they do not feel as though they have gotten sick. So, at this point, you might be feeling a little bit smarter. You've just listened to a scientific article be reviewed, but you're still wondering, why is this information important to me and how can I apply it to my life? As a group of people, all humans will face some form of chronic stress in everyone's life and will be tempted by the often simpler but unhealthy lifestyle choices that lead to immediate satisfaction. However, it is my hope that after hearing this talk, that you will be motivated to reduce the stress levels and make healthy life choices that will lead to greater overall health in your life. This article very briefly covers the increased levels of cortisol and epinephrine in our body during stress levels are high. Although it is not known to the researchers at the time of this publication, it is now known that increased levels of these hormones have direct link to bone loss, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, which leads to heart disease. None of these diseases are things we want, but all of us will encounter stress in our lives. So how do we avoid developing these illnesses? The most helpful thing you can do to get rid of stress in your life is to deal with the things that are causing the stress whenever possible. This is, however, is not always an opportunity. There are many other coping techniques that you can do. I have just listed a couple here that have been shown to help people as a whole. So the first one is to do something you enjoy. This could be as simple as going outside, or it might mean going on a road trip overnight. This is completely up to you, but just something to allow yourself to live without experiencing that crippling stress. And the other one is to seek help. This may take the form of counseling for some people, but it can also take a more casual form, such as talking to a friend, family member, or a mentor. Now, reducing levels of stress is a unique process for everyone, and it is our job to find out what works for us so each individual person can enjoy a healthy life.